I had always thought that going out for a long run or a long bike ride or whatever is a kind of mini hero's journey, that we're heading off into the unknown. If you do what you're already good at, you get positive feedback right away. If you choose to explore, you don't know how it's going to turn out. I talked about the effort paradox before, right? And so you could conclude from that the harder the better, that we should like things that are just impossible. What is it that draws us to the unknown? Is this good or bad? Like, is it a good thing that I'm drawn to try something new, or is it stupid? Is it maladaptive? Is it a midlife crisis?
Hi there, and welcome to the Supporting Champions podcast. Now, my name is Dr. Steve Ingham, performance scientist by trade and training. And in these discussions with performance experts, practitioners, and performers, I explore how we deliver performance, how we support others to perform, and the underpinning knowledge and concepts at play. I really hope you enjoy the conversations from today's episode or from the back catalogue. And if you do, it'd be great if you can take a chance to like and subscribe to the channel, or for the audio, take a moment to leave a review. It really helps the show. Right, let's get into the discussion.
In this episode, I speak with Alex Hutchinson. Now, Alex is a columnist at Outside Magazine, author of the book Endure, and is one of the best in the business at writing about the science of health and performance, brilliantly critiquing studies and making sense of them for those who might be interested. In this episode, I talk to him about his new book, The Explorer's Gene, a slight departure from his writing about endurance, but a brilliant read about why we explore, strive, and wonder about the possibilities over the horizon. It's a superb book. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Welcome to the podcast. Now, can I call you Alex? Is it Hutch? Sweat Science? What do I call you?
Alex is good. Hutch is for when I was a 19-year-old runner, and that's what it was a very teammate. Hutch, come on, you got to kick harder.
I like it. Alex, good. So, what a pleasure to have you on the podcast. And you've become a real bastion for outstanding communication in the area. So it's great to have you on. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Steve. It's great to be on. I really appreciate the invitation.
Now, I'd love you, if you can, just to give us a bit of a background, because you've got a super fascinating route. It's not like you've come through this sort of linear, I guess similar sort of career route to me, but you've come through very different routes to where you are and what you're working on at the moment. I'd love to hear that bio for people to connect with.
Sure. So, to start with, what I do now is I'm a journalist, and I guess I would call myself a science journalist, and maybe even an endurance science journalist is what I spend most of my time writing about. I did not envisage that career when I started out. I studied physics in university, did a undergraduate degree, and then in England I did a PhD in physics. And eventually I spent a few years as a postdoctoral researcher in physics. In parallel with that, what I really cared about during those years of my life was running. I was a good national level middle distance runner. From Canada, I ran at the World Cross Country Championships and World University Games and some events like that for Canada. And in my late 20s, I both realized that I'd kind of reached the ceiling of my running career, and also that
I love the quote in the book, actually. You checked your national standings and your bank balance.
Yeah. It was basically a combination of those things. Like, I could go on, but I'm living with my parents, and So I realized that my running, and I had a stress fracture in my lower back just before the 2004 Olympic trials, and so not that I really had a chance of making the team, but I had a dream, and I was like, okay, I'm not going to re-up for another 4 years. And at that point, that was a good opportunity for some reflection. And I thought, I actually am not enjoying the physics that much. Don't get me wrong, I find physics interesting, but I knew the other people in my lab had a real passion for it, where they would spend 16 hours in the lab and then go home and read Physics Today or whatever. And I didn't have that passion. So I made a big leap when I was 28. I went back to university and did a 1-year degree in journalism, without really much knowledge of what journalism was about or background in it. But fortunately for me, my intuition that I would find it interesting turned out to be write. And so I then had about a year and a half as a newspaper reporter, as an intern, doing the sort of car crashes and dog fashion shows and things, learning to talk to people and to write a lot of stories fast. And then I became a freelancer. So that was 2006. I guess I started as a freelance journalist, initially as a very general freelance journalist, just anything to pay the bills, basically. But I had two, as I just mentioned, I had two areas of expertise. One was science, and the other was, running, or more broadly, endurance sports. And I was interested in both. And so I started to try and leverage those as sort of calling cards or areas of expertise as a freelancer. And eventually, inevitably, I sort of combined them. Well, what about the science of endurance? I hadn't studied physiology. To my sort of retroactive surprise, I didn't really even know there was this whole world of studying the science of endurance, which I would have found fascinating when I was 19 had I known about it. But I came to it as a journalist, as a runner, as a former scientist, and that's really been that's become my focus, and it's what I've been writing about. These days, I'm a columnist for Outside Magazine. I also write for various other publications, and it's all around this theme of trying to understand the science of endurance and fitness and health more broadly.
Amazing. And there must be some underpinning value for having gone through that hardcore physics route and that study for you to be able to assess the quality of evidence, for example, in scientific writing, so that you're able to bridge the published, and just because it's published doesn't mean it's any good. So assessing quality evidence and bring that to life for people.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One is just not being intimidated by equations and Greek letters and complicated sentences. I think a lot of journalists come from a humanities background. And so there's a tendency to sort of defer to the, if the sentence is complicated enough or if the math looks threatening enough, there's a feeling, well, we can't challenge this because we don't understand it. I'm like, well, I went through some fairly challenging math. And so even if I don't know the physiology or, and I would say now I know quite a bit of physiology, but even when I was starting out, I wasn't scared if there was a differential equation or, and so I was willing to read the papers fully and then to talk to scientists. And I was also, one thing you learn in physics, or at least you have to learn in physics, is it's okay not to know, not to understand, to ask 6 times, no, please, can you explain that again? I still didn't understand it because no one understands quantum mechanics, right? So it's, you get over your shame of not knowing. And so I was fine trying to seem informed, talking to scientists, but also just to say, look, I don't understand. Can you explain this to me again? And so I think those were really helpful. But yeah, there's also, in terms of assessing research quality and just trying to follow the logic, I think studying physics probably helped that, but it's also, that's probably just a reflection of like, I have my personality or my outlook is such that I really want things to make sense, and I want things, A to lead to B and lead to C, and so I'm willing to follow those, to look really carefully at the structure of logic and evidence, and I think that's been helpful as a journalist.
Nice. And what did you learn at journalism school? I'm intrigued to know in terms of the principles, because I think I'm intrigued to ask as much because I think that there is a challenge for external communication for scientists. I use a good example, which is based in physics, that certainly when I've managed science-based teams, managed high-performance systems, the one that some people don't get that much is biomechanics. I don't get it. Or, physiotherapy, yes, because my athletes are injured. Those guys over there look tired, so they perhaps could do with talking to the nutritionist. But biomechanics, I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't really get it. And so I think the quality of a good biomechanist is their ability to communicate and make those principles simple. So that's the sort of origin. But I'm keen to know, what did you discover and how does that inform your way of working?
Yeah. So So I did a 1-year journalism course, which is shorter than it's possible to spend 4 years or whatever doing journalism. And part of it, to be totally honest, was a rebranding exercise or a credentialing exercise.
Okay.
There's a lot of journalists who don't go through formal journalistic training, and a lot of them do very well these days. I mean, it's more common these days to study journalism, and part of that is because it's so competitive that having that, having a degree helps you get in the door. In terms of what I actually learned, and again, this is maybe a little different than what you're asking, but the truth is, probably the most valuable things I learned were about the structures and norms and patterns of different styles of journalism and the language. So that you're on the same page as editors you may want to work with, that and understanding. So if I were to read before journalism school, if I were to open a magazine and read a 3,000 word piece, I would just read it and I would enjoy following through it and not really think about the underlying structure. Journalism school dissected the structures of different kinds of stories so that you could see very clearly that almost every news story follows a similar template of, there's a lead, there's what's called a nut graph or a billboard paragraph, and then there's various types of building blocks that are inserted in a very predictable way, for good reason, because it helps, you need to draw the reader in with an opening story. Let's say you need to, make it relatable, but then you need to, very early in your article, you need to make it clear, what is this, what is the promise? What is the story about? And what are you going to learn if you stick with it? And so on. And all these forms can be broken and should be broken, if the circumstances call for it. But understanding these forms, gives you a template with which to tell stories. So that's the technical side. I think the big picture side, which I think relates more closely to what you were saying about biomechanists, is the idea of really thinking carefully about audience. So what is the reason for having these structures in the way stories are told? It's because you have to put yourself in the seat of in the brain of the audience, of your prospective audience, understand what is going to make them interested. What are they looking for? What do they need to know to continue on in this story, to keep reading rather than flipping the page or clicking away? And doing that it's a good way of, it helps you to write the story in a good structure, but it also helps you to think very carefully about what message you're trying to get across. And so to bring it back to the idea of the biomechanists, or more generally, the scientists. So as an ex-physicist, I have sympathy for what scientists, if I'm interviewing a scientist, they're often very apprehensive about how their message, how they will be portrayed, how they will be quoted, what message they will be conveying. And I don't mean this to sound patronizing, but fundamentally that concern is rooted on what their fellow scientists will think about them. They're not worried that the average reader will think, "Oh, this guy is overinflating his research." They're worried that the guy down the hall or in at another university is going to say, "So and so is overhyping his research or oversimplifying his research." And if you write an article that is directed at making yourself look good to your peers, or if you're communicating in a way that is focused on what your peers will think, it is inevitably not going to be a good way of communicating with the broader public, because you're not thinking about what will they think, and ultimately you have to be willing to simplify, generalize, tell stories in a way that is not how you would speak to a colleague, because your colleague already knows shares your specialized language. Sorry, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but anyway.
No, I think it's important.
It's audience.
I think it's important, yeah. I think a lot of people can relate to that, because I'm an applied scientist. I have a research background, but that research is embedded in performance. And so ultimately, I'm trying to work out so what, and trying to extract that from the published literature. You end up then contacting scientists, and you can have a private conversation, but it then loops me back to why what would be so wrong in having a section on a scientific paper that is, here's what I reckon, here's what I think, and that can be prefaced with, this is only my interpretation, but it is an interpretation beyond the vague and cautionary open statements that reviewers might have hammered out of people, or that they are prejudging in their writing so that they don't get lampooned because of overstating. But some sort of offer, this is my interpretation of how this could be useful beyond scientific structures.
The only problem with that is that it would put me out of business, because that is that is the fundamental thing that's missing. So I most of what I write as a journalist is based on reading scientific papers, and the key factor that will determine whether I can write about this paper intelligibly is if I can discern what the scientist actually thinks as to why this is valuable. Because you read a lot of papers where it's like, if you don't read between the lines, if you just read what's in there, it's like, this is the most inconsequential, insignificant, meaningless paper you could imagine. And that's not the case. The paper is not meaningless. It's just that they're unwilling or unable to say what they really think. And so if I can get a scientist on the phone who trusts me enough to say, so basically what we think is that this is what's happening, and this is why we're following this research, then it's like, oh, that's fascinating. I would love to write about that. And look, some scientific papers have that, and actually where it happens, like the smoking gun is actually usually in the first 3 paragraphs of the paper. It's not a lot of room, but some scientific papers use that opening 3 paragraphs to give you the context and say, here's why this matters. People have been wondering about this. If we could figure out this, then we would know that. So here's why we're doing this study. And it's, oh, it all makes sense. I can write about it. But very few papers do that well. And sometimes I have enough background in a specific sub area that I'm aware of why they're doing this. But if it's a paper that's not shooting straight down the middle of my expertise, and if the paper doesn't tell me why, it's very, very hard. And because scientists are, for reasons I understand, because they're very cautious about whether it's for the reviewers or just not wanting to to look like they're, oversimplifying or overstating. So that's fundamentally what I do as a journalist. But it's also, I think, I will say, I way more of the scientists I talk to these days are conscious of this and are trying to find ways of making the results speak to a broader, to the target audience, to the people who it's really intended to help. So people are aware of this now, but the structures are still kind of in place that make it hard to just say what you think.
Yeah. Well, I think there's probably something before the research and after. So I was in the UK, we have something called the Research Excellence Framework, which is a big scoping exercise to review, was your research any good? Both comparing chemistry, biology, as well as sports science, for example, and within. And so which universities are producing some of the best work, and it's all evaluated against each other. And so I was on that panel as an impact assessor, which is my job is to evaluate whether this research was useful, both in terms of direct, broad reach, and significance. And then as a consequence of being on that panel, lots of universities asked me, okay, you're an applied sports scientist working with elite athletes, tell us what's the inside line about how we can make our research more impactful. And I said, you probably just need to do a little bit at the start as to why that research is useful. What's the problem you're solving first, rather than trying to fill the gaps in knowledge. Be more specific about that part, because that then creates the case. And then the so what? What difference does it make? How did you communicate that to the world? How did you translate those findings so that somebody out there could use your research rather than just being buried on a library shelf or on PubMed? And so those are sort of the two sides that I felt could be beneficial. And you've highlighted that side in terms of the scoping, the why, what's the purpose, what's the underpinning rationale that allows this research to be significant.
Yeah, as I said, I think it's something that people are more aware of, but I think we've got a long way to go. But it's a real pleasure to read a scientific paper where after the 3 paragraphs, I understand the why. And then better yet, as I said, you get to the end of the discussion and understand what's going to change as a result, or what should change, or what might change.
And how has your writing evolved over the time you've become specifically a journalist, but specializing in the science of fitness, but specializing quite a lot in endurance?
Yeah, I guess the biggest aspect of that journey is that at the beginning, I came in as a complete outsider. I had no opinions. I had no prior knowledge. And that's a mixed blessing, right? So I didn't know what I didn't know, but I also didn't have any prejudgments. So, for example, there are some really controversial topics this is circa 2008, 2009, 2010, big debates about things like hydration and carbohydrate. I mean, it sounds familiar. There's still debates, but I had no stake in which was right and which was wrong. And so I was able to write about it in a way that without I guess I'm tiptoeing around. There are some controversial characters like Tim Noakes who, for a variety of reasons, have become extremely controversial, and to the point that sometimes even when they have good messages, those messages tend to be shot down or ignored.
Right.
And so I didn't have any of that baggage. I didn't have any of the political background, and so I was really able to, I think, be a voice on the outside, a dispassionate, neutral party to look and say, hey, you know what? Actually, I think the research on dehydration is not as strong as certainly I would have assumed before I dug into it. As time has gone on, 10 years later, or actually 15 years later, I know a lot more about the history of all the controversies in these areas and what the nature of the evidence is. I'm a much more knowledgeable writer about these things, but it's also impossible to escape the trap of experience, and that I've now written about all these topics. I've stated opinions, and so it's a very human thing that if I wrote that I don't believe the dehydration research is very strong, it becomes harder for me to look at a new study and not bring my own previous opinions to it. So I think I'm conscious of that, and I really try not to get married to my to opinions that I've stated before. But it's I would say I'm more expert, but less completely neutral. And I guess the other big trend after 15 years in this area is that I'm a lot more skeptical of individual studies, even if they're placebo-controlled, double-blinded. I recognize, so it's not just that crappy studies produce unreliable results. It's also just the roll of the dice. You do a study, and these studies are small for reasons that are fully understandable. It's not possible to get 100 Olympic gold medalists to come to your lab, for 7 consecutive weeks. So they're small studies. You do it right, you do it well, you get a result that seems positive. It just, quite often, they're not replicated 5 years later, 10 years later. And so even when a result is well designed, or a study is well designed, I'm now my threshold for writing about any sort of ergogenic aid is higher. It gets higher with each passing year, I would say.
So ergogenic aids, you've mentioned it, so I'll quote you on this. Most supplements don't work, but that's not the worst part. That you wrote about this time last year, so 2024, and it's got one of the I particularly like this, but it's just the mischief in me. But also probably because most of my career I'm working with athletes, myth busting. And I'm filtering those studies. The single study that's shown something because I have learned by mistake that if I surface that and take that single study to an athlete, and it doesn't really stack up, I lose face. And so the threshold for evidence has to be greater. Stuff that sticks around, stuff that is underpinned by good first principles thinking. So like creatine, for example, inspiratory muscle training, as novel interventions that stack up. But we are, as a community, probably having to put out fires and myths all the time. So this was you wrote this. So I'd like to hat tip to this. Did you just say uh-oh?
Yeah.
Well, you press published. I mean, I can't complain about that.
Yeah.
Whenever I see someone touting the merits of, say, neuroscientist and podcaster Andrew Huberman's $370 supplement stack, I'm tempted to go full PubMed on them. You really think that herbal extract Fidogia agrestis is going to boost your health span and muscle performance? Based on an obscure study of male albino rats published in the Asian Journal of Andrology back in 2005. A grand total of 0 human trials is what Huberman means by robust foundation of science. Love that. Love that. But that was square and center on, okay, you buy into this hype based upon a platform, based upon a shopping button on a website, under the shroud, under the false pretenses of robust foundation of science. Sorry, no, that's not acceptable. That doesn't feel like that is an honest. That feels like a grift. That's my interpretation.
Yeah, look, there's a big spectrum of people who are well-meaning supplement pushers or who are doing their best to understand the science, but have a threshold of evidence that I disagree with, all on one spectrum, and to the other end of the spectrum where it's a pure grift. I used Andrew Huberman in that article as an example because at the time I didn't know much about him. I thought, hey, he's a Stanford neuroscience professor. He must be on this end of like trying to follow the science, but maybe not familiar. I mean, he's a little bit out of his lane and not familiar with the research on health and ergogenic aids. That was maybe a year ago or 2 years ago or something like that. Now I would say, I misjudged him. He's on the grifting end of the spectrum. So I was at the time surprised because I went to his website to look for to sort of understand what he was recommending, and he has this long list of supplements, and because he's the science guy, each of them has backed by science. Click here to get the science. So I was like, oh, cool. I'll look up the science, and so that's what I was shocked. He listed I can't remember if there was maybe 3 studies to back up this one particular Fidogia agrestis. One of them was a study that had did not mention Fidogia agrestis in any way. One of them was a review that just was summing up other research unrelated to this. And one of them was this 2005 study on albino rats in the Asian Journal of Andrology. It's like so it's not just like a misinterpretation of evidence. And he's on record as saying that, you have to have human evidence or human trials. It's like he's directly contradicting what he's, anyway. So all of which is to say, there are other people who give really liberal advice about take this, take that, try this. I take this drug, and I disagree with them. But I think they're reading the evidence and they're honestly, they're just more credulous than I am. Huberman, I think he's just a grifter.
Yeah, and I think one of the other features of your writing that comes out and chimes with the essence of the messaging that comes through the guests that I ask on the podcast. Now, there may be a bias there, but I often ask people, what's the method, what's the plan, and I'm trying to do that to try and to provide people with some nuggets to go away with. Very few scientists do that. Very few practitioners do that. Very few coaches will say, oh, here's the formula. This is what you need to follow. And so a lot of what I read in your writing is, it depends. It's not clear. Or might be some instances that lend themselves more to a certain approach, but it's not a formulaic way of working. So I love that ambiguity. the nuance, the subtlety, the context setting that I think is so important that you often don't hear in the influencer community. Here's my 54 pill supplement stack, and here's the and you can click through on my affiliate links, etc., etc.
Yeah, I will say, I think there are multiple roles that need to be played, and at some point, people do need to be told or advised, okay, but what should I do? And you know, if feedback I get from, even for my last book, Endure, people say, oh, I really enjoyed this really nuanced discussion of endurance, but you didn't tell me how I'm supposed to boost my endurance. And I'm like, I get it. Believe me, I wish I had the formula for endurance. I don't. If you're an athlete, you're going to want a coach or a scientific advisor or whatever to tell you, okay, taking into account all the ambiguity, the understanding that we don't know the final answer, you should take creatine this much, this often, for this many days before. So there's definitely a role for that.
Yeah.
But I would like to think that people who are following the advice of someone who's telling them to do this, they will also want to understand what the context is, what the strength of the evidence is. And so my role is help people understand what the big picture is, what the nature of the evidence is. Someone still has to say, do this or don't do this, try this or don't try that. And if you're trying it, here's what the dose is. But I think it's nice to separate those roles in some ways so that I'm not trying to dispassionately evaluate the evidence and also saying, click on my affiliate link, as you point out.
Yeah. I mean, I'm hatching a book at the moment that does provide a bit of advice in this area, but it's around how to change your physiology. But it has to be predicated on the context. It has to be predicated on what your goal is. Are you recovering from burnout, or are you trying to look and feel good, or are you trying to push for an athletic goal? Because if you want to recover from burnout, it's not the same as pushing for an athletic goal, because you might not feel great when you're going for that. Love talking to you about your background, your journalism, and your approach. It's illuminating for me as a recipient of your words and on those platforms. But I'd love to talk to you about your new book, The Explorer's Gene. Now, I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And so credit to you for writing a book that's perfect for me.
That was the goal.
Thank you so much. It is for me the sweet spot of performance, existence, wonder, our origins, ideas to make your life more interesting and blended. So yeah, I had a real feel of Daniel Lieberman, Alice Roberts, Richard Dawkins, some of my favorite authors. So thank you for assimilating. And so what inspired you to write it?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for the kind words. And I should, I'll acknowledge too that we've just talked about how I've become the specialist in the science of endurance, and this has been my journalistic focus. And so this book is a bit of a departure, right? I wrestled a lot with this. Basically, my last book, Endure, was
which we have here.
Excellent!
I've thumbed it. Go and buy it. It's a terrific read. There you go. There's your plug.
I appreciate the plug, and it's available at fine stores everywhere. So it was out in 2018, and it really it did well. It found an audience, and so I had a fork in the road at that point of do I get working on Endure 2? More secrets from the science of endurance.
Endure longer.
Yeah. Or do I do something else? And the logic, the smart thing to do would have been get cracking on Endure 2. That would have made a lot of sense. But it didn't seem exciting to me to just sort of dive back in and try and do more of the same. I was really pulled to trying to do something new. And I got thinking about that, and what was that pull? Why I'd spent 15 years trying to get to this stage where I could be someone who could write books about the science of endurance, why did I want to do something different? And then that sort of made me think about connections to other areas of my life. My vacation habits are sort of famously masochistic. Even with my family, we tend to go into fairly deep backcountry locations looking for places where we can kind of pretend that, look, we're not explorers or anything like that, but where we can pretend that we're, treading in new places, going where others haven't gone. And I thought, like, what is this all about? Like, the world is fully explored. Why do I have in various aspects of my life this desire to try something new? And so that essentially was the genesis of this book. I decided to look into, okay, what is it that draws us to the unknown? Is this good or bad? Like, is it a good thing that I'm drawn to try something new? Or is it stupid? Is it maladaptive? Is it a midlife crisis? And what do we get out of the pursuit of new things? And as I dug into it, it turned out there's a whole scientific literature that tries to understand these questions from sort of mathematical, neuroscientific, biological perspectives. And so I had a lot of fun digging into that for a few years.
Yeah, it spoke to me on a personal level. So I was a sprinter, track sprinter, and that meant I was just running up and down in a straight line with no one else coming at me. But then I stopped sprinting for similar reasons to yourself, back injury and so on. And then when I became a dad in 2003, I put on a bit of weight. I started to get into running and drawn to endurance and then eventually a few years later to cycling for reasons ultimately around metabolic health and cardiovascular fitness. But the unintended consequence was that I suddenly started to have a deeper connection with my locality. I then wanted to explore more. I had a much better sense of what's over there and what's over there. And there was something grounding in that, which then eventually led to me cycling from the bottom of the UK Land's End, as it's known, to John O'Groats, the top.
Wow.
Of which that's a ultra endurance exercise, of which I'm mostly concerned about the distance and the ascent. But the biggest takeaway was connected to the terrain, connected to my country, that I had not imagined, other than how many grams of carbohydrate I've got to take on board, that I had my head down and didn't think about how much I would connect. And it probably started to get me thinking about, why do people do these crazy things? Why do people pioneer? And I've often thought about some of the Olympic champions that I've worked with, and I thought, gosh, if you were in our tribe, I bet you'd be the one who'd say, I reckon we could get across that stretch of water. I reckon we could summit that mountain. The people who, as you put it, push the boundaries. There's some people that push the boundaries, but other people keep the fires burning. That sense of that you need a mix of these sorts of people in your tribe, and that's what it felt like. It was the fundamental sort of theme of the book, of that pull to explore, but also to stay grounded.
Yeah, and I would say one of the things that I had to think about is I initially envisaged this book as kind of the case for exploring, why we should all explore more. Right. But as I got into the topic, I realized that it's a lot more complex than that. That even so, within a tribe, let's say, you need people serving different roles. But even within our own individual lives, there are times when we will be more exploratory, and there are areas of our lives where we might be more exploratory, and there are other times or other areas of our lives when we will be less exploratory. And that if you always explore, then it's often framed in terms of the explore-exploit dilemma. Like, are you going to exploit the knowledge you have or the experience you have or explore something new? And both of them are important. It's like, you can think of the example of like listening to music. People tend to explore a lot when they're younger, and then by the time they're in their 20s, they kind of know what they like, and their tastes tend to narrow. They stop exploring. Now you could say we should keep exploring more music. You should. I'm 49. I should still be listening to new music and not just going back to what I loved when I was 21. But at the other end of the spectrum, if I was to say my policy is explore only, I'm going to listen to only new songs, and I will never listen to the same song twice. I mean, that would be moronic, right? Like, it's like, what's the point of never, I find a song I love. It's like, well, it's too bad. I have to keep exploring. I'm never going to listen to this song again. So I guess I realized that it's not about always explore more, but it's about understanding what's drawing you to explore, and then figuring out, is this the right time to explore? Is this the right context in which I should be pushing my limits, finding something new? And just to your point about the ultra endurance events, just one thing I'll add is, one of the sort of inspirations or things I thought about when I was forming the idea for this book was Joseph Campbell's concept of a hero's journey, that going out on a quest. And I had always thought that going out for a long run or a long bike ride or whatever is a kind of mini hero's journey, that we're heading off into the unknown. We're going to confront trials or we're going to have the struggle. Maybe we're going to encounter a mentor
along the way.
Yeah, there's going to be all these stages of the journey that happen in miniature on a 45-minute run, and at the maximum if you're cycling from Land's End to John O'Groats. All of these things are kind of encapsulated in this idea of a hero's journey, and so it's totally fascinating to me to discover that Joseph Campbell was a world-class runner. He was one of the fastest 800-meter runners, of his day in the 1920s. He was a second off the world record at the time. And of course, Joseph Campbell understood the hero's journey. He was a runner, and in interviews at the end of his life, he said the peak moments of his life, they all came in running, in racing, in those moments where everything was up for grabs and he didn't know whether he would win or lose a race.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that. I teach and share the hero's journey a lot. Certainly people, when they read the stages, they could relate to the athletic endeavor about a call to action, mentor support, friends and allies. Friends and allies, for example, as soon as you publish or you let your friends know on Facebook or Instagram that you've entered a marathon, suddenly it becomes real. Entering the dark cave will be some sort of glycogen depletion.
The refusal of the call, I think, is classic. Who among us, upon signing up for a race, hasn't been like, actually, I think I don't want to run this race after all. I think I don't want to take on this challenge. You try to refuse it, but something calls you, and you end up plunging in anyway.
James March, then. So explore or exploit. I read this years and years ago, and I was delighted when I saw it as a theme, key theme in the book, as a concept. We'll ask you to sort of refer to it in a moment. But is there an irony in you not exploiting more endurance book 2, and you going off and exploring an exploring book, that you've branched away rather than rinse and repeat exploit?
It's definitely, there's a meta element to this. Like this, I actually had in my initial draft of the book, I had a much longer section explaining how this whole writing of the book was a reflection of my exploit dilemma. And my editor was like, people like to see introspection, but no one likes to read a book where the introduction is like, I'm not sure why I'm writing this book. So keep this part off the record, obviously. No, but yeah, for sure. I would say, interestingly, I enjoyed this, whatever it was, 3-4 year diversion where I was really spending a lot of time digging into this area of research that was totally new to me, all this exploring stuff. It was hard to sort of start afresh in an area that I didn't know. One of the consequences has been, I enjoyed exploring, but I would say I've found renewed joy in I write once a week for Outside Magazine about a science of endurance study. And it's fresher to me now, having spent a few years trying to do something different. Now I no longer feel like, I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. It's when you've been doing the same thing for a long time. So I'm enjoying exploiting now more because I'm not wondering what's on the other side of the fence. I've gone and I've done something different, and I'm like, yeah, this was fun, but I'm looking forward to getting back to my bread and butter, which I'm good at and I enjoy.
Interesting. And I suppose there's a theme when you start to widen your perspectives later in the book, when you're thinking about what does this all mean, that the push to explore, to innovate, to look for new territory or to look for new ideas, versus the pressure to stay put, to stay grounded, just stay safe, stay in your comfort zone, don't take risks, be prudent. The pull at different times could or should feel like a bit of a rhythm. That there'll be times when you might need to push yourself, you might need to hunker down. A very simple level, if you have got limited resources, you might try and make the most of those, or you might go and prospect.
Yeah, or another example in terms of the rhythm of it is when my kids, my kids are now 8 and 11. So 5 years ago, when they were 3 and 6, if I'm doing my math correctly, life was pretty hectic, right? Like I was getting a lot of exploration from just trying to follow my kids around and keep my nose above water. And so what I found is in other areas of my life, I was less interested in exploring. I was listening to the to the albums that I listened to when I was 18. I was going back and I was running just 5K races. I didn't feel like tackling orienteering races, or adventure races, or longer things. I didn't need other novelty in my life. Things are, I would say, stabilizing a little bit. The kids are getting a little more self-sufficient, and as a tear rolls down my cheek here. So I'm feeling a little more call to get out and do different things and find, explore in other areas of my life. So there is a rhythm to it. You mentioned James March, and he was, in 1991, he wrote this paper that really kind of crystallized this idea of an explore-exploit dilemma. And one of his big points was the feedback encouraging us to exploit is very direct and ever present and fast. If you exploit, if you do what you're already good at, you get positive feedback right away. If you choose to explore, you don't know how it's going to turn out. It's uncertain, and you may not find out for, depending on the context, months or years or whatever the case. Like me deciding to write a book about exploring, this decision came, 5-6 years ago, more than that, 7 years ago. It'll be 8 or 9 years from that decision till I know whether it turned out well. And so as a result, because the feedback for exploiting is faster and stronger, we tend to get locked into, or if we're erring on one side or the other, we tend to err on the side of exploiting more and not exploring as much as we should, because the rewards are a little more unclear. So that's one big message I took away, which is not that you explore all the time, but just to bear in mind that when you're making these decisions, remember that it'll feel good if things turn out well. It just may not feel good right away. And so you have to kind of cast your mind into the future and say, 5 years from now, will I be glad if I took a chance and did this exploring thing?
Yeah, that exploit pressure, I think, is probably the best example that I've experienced or seen working with champions through multiple cycles is that people tend to be more averse to changing as they progress, because they just want to repeat what they've done, with the assumption that this routine got me to world champion, the same routine got me to Olympic champion, and therefore why would I change it? Why would I change that? There's the evidence that it's successful, and yet it might not be the thing that gets to the second Olympic gold medal, or the third, or the fourth, or the fifth. As they age, as the competition changes, etc., etc., that sense of crystallization of the process, probably in correlation with the degree of success that someone's experienced, is such a powerful message to just do the same again.
And understandably, you don't want to.
Of course,
you don't want to get to the Olympics. You come fourth, and you're like, "Boy, I'm an idiot. or you don't make the final. Like I succeeded this other time and I changed something and now look at me. But like you said, it's chances are doing the same thing over and over again is actually not going to optimize your performance for the second or third Olympic cycle. But it's a delicate dance. But there's a lot of, like you said, the logic seems to support don't change anything if it's working, and that can be paralyzing.
Yeah, and so I read the Explore and Exploit decades ago, and it was after we'd been through a process which really sort of was one of the fundamental parts of developing the high performance system in Britain. And roughly speaking, the advantage for a lot of sports followed this model, was to scope out the different variables, scope out what do we know about these individuals, whether that's physiological, psychological, and then try and model that. Try and get a sense of what are the things that determine success, and some deterministic statistical modeling. What determines success, and what are the factors that give the biggest contribution across the board, and where are the individual differences? What are the bits that seem to show for one person, well, that's making your boat go faster, but this one isn't, and then focus on an individual level if it's possible, but focus your attention on developing that particular quality so that it doesn't act as a limiting factor anymore. And then you reassess. So it was the scope was this sort of exploration phase. The condensing of the models was a sense making, and then it was focus, which was exploit. But you had to keep going through that rhythm, because what might have been a limiting factor in one instance, 5 years down the line, it wasn't anymore. So that was my sort of interpretation of how we'd use this. But it was all a bit hindsight view of, oh, that's a model there. We've done something like that.
Well, it's confirmation that you're that the model makes sense, that you're hitting these different buttons. Because the explore exploit kind of tension, it really is it's everywhere, from the micro scale, like from what an individual is going to do on a given day, to the system and organizational level, which is, and the societal level. We make decisions as a society, like how much are we going to invest in R&D? So I think it's definitely a multi-level kind of structure that applies in a lot of contexts.
Mm. And so if we could go on a bit of a tangent, if we could, in terms of just the underpinning underpinning science behind why people might explore. You delved into particularly around pioneers and frontiers people, those willing to take a risk, but focused on those territories, such as from Indonesia to the Pacific Islands, that you can't see over the horizon, as probably the benchmark of your risk taking. You are an explorer, you are a pioneer, or slightly crazy. And it seemed to be associated with some genetic factors. Would you mind opening that up a bit?
Yeah. So one of the big questions, or one of the big debates in this area, is like, do humans have an exploratory urge? Or is it like, trees spread because their acorns blow in the wind, or their maple seeds fly in the wind, and they spread, but they're not. It's not that they have an exploratory urge, and big water crossings are really one of the smoking guns. Where actually one argument is that the settlement of Australia is the first concrete evidence of modernity, or the modern status of humans, because to get to Australia, you're not just clinging to a log. Even when water levels are quite different, you had to cross these huge water crossings where it wasn't like you could look over the rise and say, oh, there's a dot over there, let's go check it out. It's just like, here's the open ocean. We have to decide to deliberately set out and, maybe even work against the currents and winds to find out what's over the horizon. And so the settlement of Polynesia is a real smoking gun. Now, the broader picture of human migration, basically about 50,000 years ago, human ancestors had been going in and out of Africa, Europe, Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. But about 50,000 years ago, humans started spreading very rapidly and covered the whole globe. And around the same time, there was a mutation in a dopamine receptor gene that it basically changed how some fraction of the population, how sensitive they were to the stimulus of novelty. It's a gene that's currently associated with ADHD, but it's associated with novelty seeking and the desire to explore. The genetics, it's controversial. It's complicated. It's sensitive. It's not that some people are wired to explore and others aren't. But I think what we can draw from it is that we all have this reward wiring, this that responds to novelty, that responds to prediction errors when something's better than we expect. Some people have a bigger helping than others, but we all have this fundamental drive that makes us interested in novelty.
This episode of Supporting Champions podcast is sponsored by Athlete Now, the perfect platform for sports practitioners looking to expand their reach. Whether you're a sports scientist, therapist, or coach, Athlete Now helps you showcase your expertise, connect you directly with athletes, and grow your business. With no ads, no commissions, and access to industry discounts, it's designed to make your services stand out. Join as a practitioner today to get listed, promote your services, and connect with athletes who need your support. And for athletes, it's free to sign up, giving you access to exclusive discount deals and direct connections with the best in the industry. Visit theathletenow.com to find out more. Okay, so this idea that an increase in the frequency or the tendency for this polymorphism, this gene related to dopamine, appears to be a little bit, had an acceleration, had a boost in the human population around 50,000 years ago, that's probably really been tested for bridging from Indonesia to Australia, or Indonesia to New Zealand to Polynesia. But yeah, I guess your point there is, it doesn't mean that it's only people with that or higher levels of the polymorphism. I think there's 7 alleles that you identified in the book. It doesn't mean that if you haven't got that, you're not going to be an explorer, because ultimately we are explorers, aren't we? The human species are one of the biggest explorers. We've all come from this burst out of Africa.
Yeah, and the title of my book is The Explorer's Gene, and I should say explicitly here that's kind of tongue in cheek, or at least let's say provocative, that this gene, this DRD4 dopamine receptor gene, is sometimes called the explorer's gene. It's clear that there's not just one gene, that this is just one that people have identified that seems to have a measurable effect on novelty seeking and things like that. There's a ton of genes, and there's also a ton of environment, and there's context. People are exploratory in some contexts, but maybe not others. There's lots of people who don't want to go parasailing to the South Pole, but who maybe have a great thirst for novelty in their musical taste or in their intellectual lives, or in other forms of physical exploration. So I don't want to be too reductive about it, but the reason I found it interesting and the reason I put it in the book is that it does underlie this idea that there really is something hardwired in us that makes us want to, that makes the unknown attractive to us, that makes the path that we haven't followed before more interesting, all else being equal. And I mean, not to get too far off track, but you can look, there's like analysis of 1.6 million food orders from Deliveroo, looking at how people choose meals. And one of the insights that comes out of that is if you hold everything else equal, people are more like, price and rating and all this. People are more likely to want to try a restaurant that they haven't tried before, or that has fewer ratings, so that it's a lesser known quantity. So there is this sort of uncertainty bonus that we apply when we're weighing different options. The unknown one is more attractive. The gene is part of it, but it's certainly not the whole story.
Yeah, that was fascinating to read through that. And it did make me, I know this is a really incidental example. It did make me think, sometimes I just think, no, I've gone out for a meal. I'm going to try something different. I'm going to choose something that we wouldn't normally cook at home. So that really spoke to me. But then other times I just think,
I don't want to waste my money. I don't want to. I don't want to have a duff meal. I'm going to go for something that's got some certainty to it.
Well, there's the classic feeling, right? Or the classic dilemma is you're at a restaurant that you're familiar with, and you know you like one of the dishes, and you're weighing, well, should I get that because I know I like it, or should I respond to this call of, oh, I've never tried that, the special, maybe it would be good, and then sometimes the follow up is, oh, I'm so glad I discovered this new thing. It's my new favorite dish. But other times the follow up is, oh, I don't like it so much, and then the extra turn of the screw is someone else at the table ordered the dish that you usually like, and you spent the whole meal sort of looking over at their table thinking, or at their place thinking, oh, I wish I'd gotten the usual, I wish I'd gotten the pad thai that I always get instead of trying this awful slop that I'm eating. So yeah, it can go both ways. There are times when you just want to try something different, and there are times when you don't, and both of those are fine.
And just to go back to the frequency or the expression of this DRD4, you found some really compelling or certainly interesting evidence about the distance from migration in relation to higher populations that are further away from probably the point at which we came out of Africa, higher expressions of DRD4 in those furthest away.
Yeah, this was an absolutely cool finding from my perspective that you can. So the original study was in 1999, actually. A researcher took a whole bunch of populations around the world, worked with an anthropologist to estimate how far did these populations have to migrate from where they were 20 or 30,000 years before that. And then drew a graph, like how far did they migrate? How common, and did some genotyping, and how common is the explorer's version of this DRD4 gene? And it's essentially a straight line. The farther the population migrated away, the higher the prevalence of the explorer's version of the gene, to the point that in this southern tip of South America, there's groups that have 80% prevalence of the explorer's version of the gene, and in places that in Europe or Africa, quite near the origins of or where the populations have been quite stable, you're looking at 0 or 10% or 20% prevalence. So there's a big difference. Now, there's a lot of nuances to this. Does that mean that the people who had the gene were more likely to explore and end up pushing to the southern tip of South America, or is it that everyone was kind of exploring equally, but the people who had the explorer's gene, the novelty-seeking gene, were better able to survive and adapt in a novel, were they less freaked out by being in a new place because they loved new things and they were more able to adapt to new surroundings? So there's a lot of unanswered questions, but it's clear that this gene played a big role, influenced behavior, and that it varies between people and also among populations.
Right. Okay. So it does highlight some complexity to the environmental and developmental aspects there, where it could be risk taking that's meant that they're willing to go further. It could be that they are resourceful in terms of novelty seeking, in terms of problem solving, that modernity that you mentioned, that idea about, have we got a surplus of resources that we can take with us that's going to protect us? Have we got the survival skills, the seafaring skills, or the bushcraft? Can we develop those in order to take those steps forward? So, but it is very compelling that there's an association between the distances without me sort of trying to amplify a case unnecessarily, perhaps a bit like the blue zones, where there's these sort of pockets of observations around the globe, and then we draw sort of larger conclusions from them. But it does seem to create a compelling case, but it also seems to be linked to other aspects. You mentioned around name choice, so conservative names versus crazy names.
Right. The idea, because we can say that humans are wired to explore, to seek new places, but then you still have the question of, okay, so why do some people head out across the Atlantic and others don't?
Yeah.
And so there was a really fascinating analysis just a couple of years ago of there was a mass migration from Scandinavia to North America in the late 1800s and I think early 1900s. And they have very complete records of who went, like the ship's manifests. They have passenger lists. They know who went, and they know who stayed behind because they have census records. And so what they found is that by analyzing this data is that the people who migrated to North America tended to have unusual or less common first names, which the researchers take to be a signal of sort of nonconformity and novelty seeking among the families. So the assumption is it's genetic, that if your parents are like, I'm going to, name my kid, something unusual. I won't say a name by insulting people by calling it unusual.
Steve.
Yeah.
No, Steve's not.
Some crazy name like Steve. No. If they pick
Steve's
an
a good
unusual
archetypal name of a boring standard name from the 60s.
So yeah, well, it cuts. So yeah, the unusual first name people, they were more likely to get on the boat and head over to North America. Now that means the Steves of Scandinavia in the 1800s, they were more likely to stay behind. And so the argument is that there was a streak of individualism or of novelty seeking among those who migrated, and there was a streak of staying at home, conformity, collectivism in the people who stayed behind. And it may be this, and this is just speculation at this point, but one of the researchers suggests maybe that's why Scandinavia has put together such is the home of the most sort of socially oriented, collective, social democratic states, social welfare states in the world, that the people who would have been like, no, I don't want to contribute to, welfare for others. I want to do my own thing. And they all went to Minnesota and settled there. So, we're getting into the realm of speculation here, but what's not speculation is that people who migrated tended to have more unusual first names. That suggests that it's not just like they were poor. It's just there was something in their they had itchy feet, and they may have been born that way and wired that way.
Yeah, interesting. I did raise an eyebrow to numerous, I'm sure, serendipitous references to Greenland and Norway and social politics and North American politics and the volatility there at the moment. But
it's become a much more interesting topic since I wrote those words.
Yeah, well, it was all in there. I'm sure there's something in this around the volatility that's going on versus the stability that we all kind of crave, or the risks that we're taking.
Well, I don't want to get too far into armchair speculation, but one of the open questions that hasn't been settled scientifically is a place like the United States, is its population different? Because it's disproportionately settled by people who decided to go somewhere new, to take on the unknown, to head to the frontier. And so what they have looked at those DRD4 genes, the dopamine genes, and they didn't find any significant difference in prevalence or anything. But that's these are hard studies to do, and it's hard to pick up a signal. So it may well be that there's a reason for different national characteristics. But that's a complicated topic.
Let's leave that there. But it did, when I was reading that section, it did make me think about the risk-taking, prepare to put yourself on the line for elite athletes. And I don't know whether you found anything in the research that associates that sense of, I'm willing to put myself out there. I'm willing to trailblaze, perhaps go alone in terms of my pursuit and training. We know that this, for a long time, selfishness has been characteristic of certainly individual energetic-based sports. And it did make me think of that research that was done in the 80s. I think it was the Goldman effect around NFL players that were asked if you could take this pill and it would guarantee success but would shorten your life, or I think it was sort of 5 years. You've got 5 years, but you're going to be successful. Burn bright and fade away. That type of idea, it did make me think. I wonder if there's some sort of association there. They're willing to cross that water and have a go, at the cost potentially that they don't come back, or the chance they'll be a hero.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I didn't find any research that looks at, say, the dopamine receptor genes in elite athletes, but I would be very interested. I mean, when I look back at my own career as a middle distance runner, I was a very conservative trainer. My feeling was always it was better to arrive at the start line 90% trained but healthy than 100% trained but injured. And similar with pacing, I was always like, let's think carefully about what I'm capable of and don't go out faster than I'm capable of. And looking back on my career, I sort of say, maybe it would have been worth like taking more risks, really stacking up the training a little harder, seeing if I could accumulate more training, doing some races where I just go out with the leaders instead of worrying about whether. So maybe the athletes maybe the high risk, high reward kind of explorer type genotype, maybe that's what it takes to really break through to the very top levels. It would be interesting. I think obviously there are many roads to the top and many sets of characteristics that you can get there. So I don't think everyone would be that way, but it would be interesting to see if there's a higher prevalence of that explorer's genotype among great athletes, because really, once you get to the really high levels, it's hard to keep winning if you're not willing to kind of risk everything and put it on the line.
That makes me think of the section in your book around free energy principle, which is probably worth you explaining a little bit. But it's this idea of minimizing surprise, the uncertainty that's out there, or that's you're willing to accept. Can be then a pursuit for you to try and understand it. Okay, I'm just thinking about those athletes that are pushing the limit. What are they doing now? They've got wearables. They're filling in resting and recovery indices every day. They're checking in with their coach. So there's much more sensitivity and willingness to change because they're trying to reduce uncertainty.
That's a big can of worms there. So let me the free energy principle is really interesting. It's also sort of famously hard to explain, but basically some background. The free energy principle is basically this idea that's been around for about 20 years, associated with a guy named Carl Friston, a very prominent neuroscientist, and it's also related. It's another name for it is predictive processing, or at least a related concept. It's basically a theory of how the brain works, and in fact, how living things are organized. That's become increasingly prominent, and I would say it's a term that's worth filing away in your mind, because we're going to be hearing about it more as the years pass, I think. So and as you said, the free energy principle, its fundamental statement is that our brains operate, or we are wired to try and minimize surprise. In other words, our brains are always predicting what's going on around us, and we want to have as little a gap as possible between what our brains think is going to happen and what does happen. And what's interesting about this from the exploring perspective is that you would think then that what the free energy principle suggests is that we would all want to go and lock ourselves in the closet, turn out the lights, close the door, because then we can predict exactly what's going to happen next at all times. Nothing. Like we're in a dark room. And this is called the dark room problem in philosophy and in cognitive science. And basically the way out of it is to understand that we don't just want to predict what's happening right now. We want to be able to predict what's going to happen so that we don't get surprised by a monster jumping out from around the corner. And the best way to predict what's going to happen is to learn about the world. So kind of paradoxically, what the free energy principle ends up predicting is that we will be drawn towards the things we know least about, towards areas of uncertainty, towards opportunities to learn about the world. Because in doing so, by being attracted to the unknown, to exploring, we learn more about the world so that we can make better predictions and not be surprised. So that's the kind of context for that, for why I was introducing that somewhat arcane topic in the book, because it suggests that's why we're wired this way, that fundamentally we're trying to minimize surprise. Now, as you said, training at a level that where you're trying to not even necessarily be a world best, training at a level that you have never trained at before, trying to break into new territories of performance. That is a voyage into the unknown. And the extent to which wearables and wellness questionnaires and stuff, does that really give us a roadmap into that unknown? I think that's a kind of an open question, but they definitely, the goal, as you said, is to reduce the uncertainty so that you're not going to be surprised that, oh, I had no idea that I was tipping into overtraining or whatever, that you'll have some warning signs. But that's still a very, I think, it's a real art to be able to harness that information in a meaningful way.
Yeah. But also I think it opens up this idea about just the concept of progress. I think there's a phrase in there, uncertainty can be comfortable, but uncertainty is fertile. And I love that in terms of just the sense of, again, coming back to a podcast recording with Amy Edmondson around psychological safety, that the concept there that underpins safety allows you to act with confidence in uncertain situations is to test and learn as you go, so that you're seeing the opportunities ahead of you, the experiments that you're testing or the experiences as opportunities for further information, intelligence gathering, so that you're better equipped to navigate further.
Yeah, I mean, and I think a lot of what, maybe not training itself, but a big component of training is preparing yourself for the sensations you're going to experience so that you're not experiencing them for the first time. And for the context, like an example that I remember, a coach that I knew, he would sometimes give his athletes workouts where the athletes would warm up, get ready to step on the track, and then he'd say, okay, rain delay, everyone sit on the bench for 20 minutes. And then, or 15 minutes or something, I don't know how long it was. And then at the end of that 15 minutes, okay, get back on the track. Now we're going to do the workout. And so the goal there was to make sure that the athletes were ready for that experience when they stepped in competition, that it was not unfamiliar to them. And that's a very simple example of just a rehearsal of a concept so that the athlete will be familiar with it. But I think a broader goal in not just in training, but also in information is to give athletes the confidence to take a chance, because everything that can be controlled or can be introduced to them has already been done. The concept of psychological safety, I think, is one that shows up even, toddlers who feel securely attached to their parents will roam farther. It's not, if they're securely attached, it's not that they'll stay with their parent. It's they feel safe going out and exploring the world because they know there's something to come back to. And I think that's a sort of a metaphor for how athletes can explore their capabilities.
I really like the back end of the book around several different chapters that you delve into landscape of ideas and the case against passivity. The case against passivity particularly sort of stood out for me. I guess creating this campaign for things, if things are tough, they're worthwhile. That if you're setting yourself a challenge, then it's going to enrich you. If it's difficult, a bit like the Joseph Campbell stages that you go through, and you grow and you develop skills along the way. But it felt as though there was a specific point that you were trying to make there around the friction, the struggle, the interaction. That is a generator of growth as much as the experience of exploring in itself.
Yeah. So there's a couple things I think are worth maybe highlighting. One is there's this idea of the effort paradox, which is that you would think that if something is hard, it kind of subtracts from the value of something, if you think in economic terms. but there are contexts in which the fact that something is hard actually makes it more valuable to us. You can think of mountaineers trying to, go up a particular route on a mountain. They're choosing that route. There may well be, you may be able to walk to this peak from the other direction, but they're not interested in doing that. They want to try and climb up this north face or whatever, because that's the hard way of getting there. And it will be so much better to get there. And if you can take an escalator to get there, they aren't interested. And that idea recurs in a lot of areas of life. There's research on something called the IKEA effect, which is that we value more highly the furniture we've had to struggle with those crazy pictographic instructions. We'll ask for more money if we're then selling the IKEA coffee table than if we had just received it already assembled. So there are these contexts in which for some reason we actually like to struggle. And in fact, not to jump ahead to the punchline, what the psychologists think, or at least some psychologists, is that effort is a source of meaning, that things that are hard feel more meaningful to us, whether that's, a coffee table from IKEA or, having children or something like that, which is hard and also tends to be a source of meaning for a lot of people. So I think the effort paradox is something that's central to certainly endurance sports and to sports in general, that there's a definition of games that's like the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. And that's what sports are. We're setting up these unnecessary obstacles, but it's meaningful and fun to try and overcome them. So that's the effort paradox. This idea of passive versus active exploration. What I don't mean by that is that going out and trying to climb Mount Everest is meaningful, and sitting at home and reading challenging literature is not meaningful. That's not the active passive it's not about physical. It's about, are you making your own decisions? Are you choosing what you want to explore? Are you taking on the risk of failure? Or are you sitting on the computer, letting the algorithm tell you what article to read next, and then flicking on the TV and letting the algorithm tell you what to watch next? And are you not, in other words, are you not making any active decisions of your own? And so it gets a little into the weeds, but there's some pretty interesting evidence to suggest that we assimilate information differently. We learn differently when we're following our own interests and making our own decisions, than even if we're presented with exactly the same information. We don't benefit or understand it or assimilate it as well. So the case I'm making there is not that you have to go to the South Pole, but that you should be following your own interests. You should be making some decisions in some aspects of your life about what you find interesting, not just letting modern entertainment technology spoon feed you what it knows that you will in fact find interesting.
Right. My mind goes to educational systems that put people through plug and play systems. You've all got to learn this. You've all got to go through this particular route, and whatever subject you choose, there's a structure behind that. Increasingly, that's narrowing for people rather than broadening in a lot of educational institutions. The effort paradox, then, and if it's effort is the currency of meaning, if I could put you on the spot a moment, what do you think about the enhanced games, which for me feels potentially like it's hollow, because there's a speedy boarding pass to progress. We know it will be amplified, performances will be enhanced by the very name of it, but also by the nature of open drug abuse or use. So for me, that just doesn't sound like a good watch, because I don't have a connection with people. I'm moved by people trying themselves to get the best out of themselves, albeit with I don't know what they do in their personal lives, but as long as they test clean, and then I'm a fan of that pursuit. I switch off and I'm not interested. And that's the purist in me, but I'm interested to get your thought.
Yeah. I mean, look, I'm on the same page. I guess I have two levels of reaction, but the dominant one, as opposed to outrage, and I have a little bit of like outrage and that kind of thing, but the dominant one is absolute pure boredom. I just
Yeah.
I find it completely uninteresting. It's like if some organization set up, we're going to have an Olympics. It's called the 90% Olympics. We're going to have the 90-meter dash, and then we're going to run 90% of a 1500 meters and 90% of a marathon. And we guarantee the times are going to be faster than you have ever seen. We might even see an 8-second dash. It's like, yeah, but it's a 90-meter dash. Like that has no meaning. There's no, it has no connection to any contest that has had that we've been. There's no comparison to what you were doing. And I actually, so let me, so that's one. So boredom is one. I will also say that I find it despicable from the health perspective that people imagine that there's those pro athletes over there who can choose to do whatever they want. And then there's me playing soccer with my kid at the park, or football with my kid at the park. And those are two different worlds. And the fact is they're not. Because if professional athletes are allowed to dope, then college athletes are going to dope. And if college athletes are doping, then high school athletes are going to dope. And it goes down the chain. And yes, that's a bit of a slippery slope argument, but the reason, like, I know as a guy who was sort of national class and dreaming of being able to be competitive internationally, the sport was meaningful to me and fun to me, even though I didn't make it to the top. I was at a level that if doping was, more prevalent in the sport, or certainly if doping was allowed, I would have said, well, this sport means a lot to me. I now have to make a choice as to whether I want to take a drug that harms my health so that I can compete. That's just, it seems unconscionable to me. So, okay, so that's my doping thing. The last thing I'll say is just, I wrote an article a number of years ago about doping rules, because there's always this controversy like, why are we allowed to take caffeine and baking soda, but we're not allowed to take decongestants or pseudoephedrine or whatever the case may be? It's so arbitrary, we should just scrap the whole thing. And to me, those arguments are silly, because is there a clear, bright line between what we should allow and what we should not allow? No, it's a gray area between creatine and baking soda and caffeine versus, some of these things that are just on the wrong side of the line. It's always going to be arbitrary. But we make a list, we pick a line, we say these things are on the right side of the line, these things are on the wrong side of the line. You're allowed to do anything that's on this side of the line, even things that I wouldn't necessarily do, but if they're not banned, then you're allowed to do them. If they're banned, you're not allowed to do them. Those are the rules of the game. And John Rawls was a political philosopher, and I found some great stuff in his work on rules and games and things like that, and how we agree on rules. And basically, his point was like, there's no reason you couldn't have 4 strikes in a baseball game. You could play baseball with 4 strikes. We have 3 strikes in baseball. And so the point is, we all have to agree on how many strikes there are. God didn't dictate that there should be 3 strikes. But once we agree on a set of rules, those are the rules. And so for me, watching 100 meters, I understand what the rules are. You're not allowed to take steroids, because if you took steroids, you'd be faster. Are people cheating? Sure. Some people cheat in the same way that some people shoplift, and that's always going to be the case. But we're doing our best to limit or minimize the amount of cheating. Now, you can open up the cheating as much as you want, and maybe someone will run 9.2. Who cares? Like I could run 9.2, or someone could run 9.2 for 90 meters, and I would also find that insignificant. Sorry, yeah. You got me on a rant there.
No. I'm curious because I think Stephen Jay Gould wrote a compelling book. It's a long time since I've read it now, so I can't even remember the name of the book, but it was about the evolution of sports-based rules.
Oh, interesting.
And so as an evolutionary biologist, he was interested in how the games we play have to evolve over time, because as we're seeing in football, or as you call it, something else, soccer. Thank you for calling it its proper name. So Manchester City, for example, they've introduced a whole heap of tactics And then lots of teams are replicating, or at least now starting to adapt and counter those tactics, which now then means that the game gets slightly boring. And so the number of goals scored go down. So they have to start to slightly evolve the game. So there's a recent introduction to the amount of time that a goalkeeper can hold the ball for. So these little small tweaks that they have to introduce so that the game stays interesting and it stays compelling. But like you say, when there's something fundamental missing about the ethics and the morals, by the way in which we live, the equivalent, and you've given a nice one, but the equivalent in football would be, well, everyone gets a free shot at the goal without the goalkeeper there. No one's going to be interested in that. That's just practice. And so I'm interested in this from you because I think there is a sense here that the exploration serves a purpose, serves a meaning, whether it's for discovering fertile lands for our kin, or for sport. It has to serve a meaning because it's kind of pointless, really, jumping about and kicking leather into certain nets. That has, as John Amici says, sport is a vessel, an empty vessel, and we put whatever we want into it. And I'm just trying to draw those parallels between exploration and sport itself.
Yeah, and I think one of the one of the essential elements of sport is that we don't know how it's going to end, right? You find if even if you want your team to win, if your team wins 14-0 every game, it becomes very, very boring. And so one of the ways the rules of sport evolved is to try and make sure that there's a appropriate balance, that there's a sort of optimal challenge level. So when I talked about the effort paradox before, right? And so you could conclude from that the harder the better, that we should like things that are just impossible. But that's actually not what it suggests. Instead, we like things that are not too hard and not too easy. This relates to the concept of flow, for example, where you want a challenge that is just barely within your capacity. And so I think with sport, what we're looking for is a set of rules that allows us to engage on our mini quest, we head out there to play the game of football or to run our 10K or whatever the case may be, where we don't know what the outcome's going to be, where the balance is such that there's uncertainty I think that's the bridge that connects it to exploring, that we're looking for something where we don't know what's going to happen. And as soon as sport gets too predictable, it gets boring, that we no longer have that feeling, whether it's in our own personal, like, how am I going to do in this race? How will I perform? Or whether it's even as a spectator when we're watching. If it's entirely predictable, then we're not interested.
It's a fascinating read, Alex, and I really appreciate it. You got me pretty early on. You were referencing a trek, I think it was with your family, and you'd set out some map way markers, but you then reverted to a GPS. And recent evidence going around loss of critical thinking, probably because we were awash with information these days rather than sorting and working our way through problems over the years. And it's that devil of ease, isn't it? Of, I just put the sat nav on, and I think, how did I used to do this 20 years ago before sat navs? In fact, it probably wasn't very safe. But that what I took from the book was that we perhaps need a little bit of a sense check and a little bit of a moment just to have a little think about how easy we're making things, how we can embrace uncertainty and the unknown in our lives, and that fundamentally is part of the lived experience that I think enriches. What are your? That's what I took from the book. What are your hopes and ambitions that people can take from it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you put your finger on it, and it's interesting you mentioned GPS, because I'll say, sometimes people have asked, like, so what concrete changes have you made in your life as a result researching this book, and I think they're expecting me to say, well, now, I'm going to the Amazon tomorrow to try and discover a new river. And it's like,
I've deleted
no.
all trails from my app.
Yeah, but I am making a conscious effort to not use turn-by-turn navigation except when I need it in the car or even when I'm walking around. And that's partly, there's some research, looking at how it affects your brain, that you're using different parts of your brain, and partly just for the way you move through the world and what you're conscious of and what you're aware of. And so I'll be driving around, if I'm going somewhere, I'll take a look, I'll plug it into my phone and okay, that's where I'm going. That's what I need to do. This is where it is relative to that. And then I'll turn it off. And then if I need it, I'll turn it back on. This sometimes means that I miss turns. And then my kids in the back seat will be like, Daddy, what do you, like, Mommy uses Waze. Why don't you use Waze? Why, Mommy wouldn't have missed that turn. I'm like, we lost 90 seconds. Look, relax. We're going to get there. And this way, I'm looking around, like, because then if you're not using turn-by-turn directions, all of a sudden you're looking outside at the world, and because you need to know what street am I on? Where am I? How does this street relate to that street? So I'm not going to change the world by swearing off turn-by-turn navigation, but it's an example of the ways that I'm trying to be more conscious of my surroundings, of how I move through the world, of what it feels like to not know where I'm going, and how to be okay with that feeling that I'm a little unsure when the next turn is, and that I need to look out, that's actually that's a way of being present in the world as opposed to just going through it on autopilot.
Yeah, amazing. And it chimes with where I sort of started about how the book spoke to me, and that we're moving house in the summer. And one of the first things I've done is link up with some friends there, and I've booked a trek, a marathon trek around I think one of the nicest places on earth, the Purbex, the Isle of Purbex, and it's instinctively, without even realizing, that's something I've decided to do that speaks to that sense of where do I live, where am I about, and deep connection with the environment. As you've sort of hinted that geographically there's no more real discovery, but there is an experience behind exploring in that sense, isn't it?
100%. And one of the things I did after, while I was finishing the book, was buy some cheap kayaks. And right. I live in Toronto. It's a city of 3 million, but I live a block from a river. So now I'll take my kids down sometimes. Right now the river's in flood, but and we can go paddle down on this river. And I've lived in this neighborhood most of my life, so right. I know the area very well. But it's amazing how many places there are I've never, within 3 blocks of of the house I grew up in, that I've never been to. Especially when you get to see it from a different perspective, seeing it from the water. It's like, oh, I can access a marsh that is not accessible on foot. And so all of a sudden I'm discovering new things, seeing things in a new way. So look, I still love going far away and doing big backcountry treks, but I'm definitely more conscious of like, yeah, let's see what my neighborhood is about. Let's see it from different angles and learn more about it.
Kayak is on my list as well. And Toronto. I've only been to Toronto once, and took the chance to go up to Algonquin Park. And
good move, excellent choice.
Paddled there with my wife through the lakes into the interior. Wolves howling, bears running, and I don't think I've ever felt as alive, i.e., not asleep, in my whole life.
Well, someone asked me where my interest in exploring started, and I give different answers every time I get asked. But I think one good answer is 15 years old. Some friends of mine wanted to go on a canoe trip at Algonquin Park, and we were totally incompetent. We didn't know what we were doing, so it was a week of really, really hard challenges because we didn't know what we were doing. And I was totally hooked. I've gone on a either canoeing or backpacking trip basically every year since then. Algonquin's amazing. For anyone who's in the neighborhood, Algonquin is amazing. Get into the interior. But there's even though you're not discovering anything, Algonquin has been mapped very thoroughly. It is amazing to get away from everybody and to be just relying on yourself and confronting the world around you and knowing that if a bear comes, you need to understand what the situation is, and you need to be taking the correct actions to make it to the other end.
Fantastic. Yeah, very much so. Now, thank you so much for the conversation. Thanks for taking the time out to speak with me today, but also thank you for writing another epic book. I loved Endure. It's like a highlight of all the people I know. And congratulations on this new book. And if people are interested, take a look, Explorer's Gene, and keep up the good work with your writing and campaigning for clarity, understanding, facing ambiguity, but communicating science as you do. It's been brilliant to see it evolve.
Well, thanks so much, Steve, for having me. This has been a super fun conversation that kind of bridges those worlds of exploration, but also my interest in science journalism. But thanks also for the kind words about the work, and it's been a ton of fun.
Fantastic.
Hope you enjoyed today's conversation. If you did, please take a chance to press like and subscribe to the channel. And for audio, please do leave a review. Thank you.